Moving on fairly quickly, because we have a lot to get in this afternoon. So our next speaker is Philip Benwell MBE, the chairman of the Australian Monarchist League. Philip, could you come up to the platform and take the podium, please? I first heard Philip Benwell at a conference chaired by Philip Davis MP, the redoubtable pro-independence campaigner for Shipley in Yorkshire. And there were representatives from New Zealand and Canada as well. And the aim was to organise an association of Commonwealth realms, those countries which have the Queen as their head of state. Sadly, that project did not flourish, but Philip has been remarkably energetic in Australia, promoting the historic constitutional settlement and reinforcing ties with Britain. This has been so successful that the Australian Monarchist League has, I'm told, attracted a membership of 25,000, which would be equivalent to a membership of over 65,000 in Britain, scaled up for population. And even The Guardian admitted in a long article that public support for the monarchy in Australia has been strengthened considerably, and this is a great achievement against the inbuilt pressure of a politically correct establishment. One of the nastiest things about our joining the EEC was the callous cutting of the economic ties with our family and friends and relations in the Commonwealth, and the downright lies which accompanied it. People like Roy Jenkins and John Selwyn Gummer went around the country telling people that the Commonwealth countries were grown up and independent and wanted nothing more to do with us. And that was a lie. Certainly our own family business was a large customer for New Zealand milk powder, and we knew our New Zealand friends didn't want to lose their best customers. But we couldn't use New Zealand milk powder after we joined the EU. So now the opportunity is open for a new and happier chapter in our relationship with our fellow Commonwealth realms, and it is a pleasure to welcome Philip. In shared social and constitutional terms, Australia is nearer to us than Austria or any other European country, in spite of the width of the ocean between us. And it is time for another happier chapter in the relationship between the newly liberated home country and the grown-up countries of the Commonwealth with whom we have so much in common. So Philip, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen and friends, it's always good to visit England, but it's really exciting to set foot for the first time in many years in a Britain that is well on the pathway to being free from the shackles of European domination. Thank goodness for democracy, and thank God the European Union, encumbered as they are by their stifling bureaucracy, did not get around to removing the British vote as they have removed so many British laws, British rights, and British traditions. Remember all the wisers, the doom and gloom soothsayers, despite their predictions of a collapse, of a calamity, both before and after the Brexit vote, the British economy has defied all expectations and instead of collapsing, seems to be going from strength to strength. Even that most Europhile of financial institutions, Morgan Stanley, is forecasting that the UK economy will expand by 1.8% this year, up from a previous forecast of 1%. Remember the number of foreign political and other dignitaries all begging the British to remain in Europe at the behest of David Cameron, but now so many seem to have joined the Brexit bandwagon. In Australia, other than our politicians, who always seem to be at odds with the people, the majority of our Conservatives supported Brexit as being good for Australia and good for the United Kingdom, whereas the majority of left-wing socialists agitated that Britain should remain within the European Union as it was in accord with their global aspirations. Last year I spoke in London about the need for the United Kingdom to exit the European Union at the referendum, which was then being held shortly. Otherwise, there would be no hope ever for a sovereign and independent Britain to survive intact. Some of my observations are repeated in this talk because I believe that they are important comments, and I hope that the few of you who were at my earlier talk will forgive me for this. Let me start with my firm conviction that Britain entering the European Union is something that should never, ever have occurred. You were led into it. You were led into it by treachery, deceit, and lies. As far as Commonwealth countries like Australia are concerned, we always valued the British rule of law and treasured the British traditions that we inherited. Our parents were honoured to be part of the empire. However, Macmillan and Heath and those who followed treated us so shabbily that any thought of family was dispelled. But that is now in the past, and we must now look to the future. Whilst we in the Commonwealth, and particularly several of the Commonwealth realms, have a heritage which we share with Britain, countries like Australia have naturally progressed in their own way. Today, Australia makes its own decisions and elects its own parliaments. That was how it was always meant to be. Britain encouraged Australia to gain independence as it did to all of its former dominions following the loss of its American colonies. But just because we are independent, just because we are a sovereign nation, does not mean that we should isolate ourselves totally, both from the United Kingdom and from sister countries like Canada. Despite the separate sovereignty we in the realms enjoy today, there is nevertheless only one Queen, one coronation oath, and in accordance with the Statute of Westminster of 1931, there is but one crown under which the realms are united in common allegiance. This, however, did not seem to prevent Britain from commencing the separation of the British peoples. Firstly, in 1948, by creating a national citizenship, and then an alliance with Britain's ancient foes and former enemies. Nowhere during this process was any provision made for those persons outside of the United Kingdom who had Her Majesty as their sovereign and who were thus subjects of the Queen. It is to be regretted that it was always the British politicians taking the first steps towards severing ties with its former dominions rather than strengthening them as it should have done. The plain fact is that whereas Britain built itself up on the back of the empire, once its politicians envisaged greener pastures in joining the common market, they dumped us. Yes, the former dominions of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand that Churchill once decreed should become an ever closer union with Britain were dumped by the motherland, leaving us all to go our separate ways. The trauma that was caused at the time was devastating to our economies. Small townships that were reliant upon the sales of agricultural produce, such as sugar and meat, and likewise in New Zealand with milk, butter, and wool, under existing trading arrangements, went broke, as did numerous support businesses. At the time, sugar in Australia was a mainstay, leading to the development of coastal townships up and down the northeast coast of Australia. There were numerous bankruptcies and even suicides, all because Britain decided to join with Europe. Britain's action in moving away from our close and familial relationship were partly responsible for the move towards a republic in Australia, with former Prime Minister Paul Keating decrying Britain as the country that walked out on us and joined the common market. At the time it was written that only the fall of Singapore ranks as a more jarring dose of perfidious Albion. Indeed, when the European powers told Britain that the Commonwealth agreements had to end, the British government should have had the backbone to refuse. But instead, Britain, with the British politicians, took Britain into what became the European Union, and it was thus that the process of undermining Britain's sovereignty by its own parliament began. In this manner, the close rapport that once existed between the British peoples was purposefully dismembered as Britain humbled itself before Europe, pleading for entry into the club it itself had created, but for Europe, never for Britain itself. For nearly 20 years, I have been speaking in the United Kingdom of the dangers of what firstly began as a trading arrangement with Europe, but which ended with almost total political and economic union, the ever closer union of the peoples of Europe was always its underlying purpose. In the first instance, Britain should never have dumped and abandoned its former allies in the Commonwealth to join the European Common Market. Immediately that requirement was put to the British government, it should have walked away. As the new treaties came into play, eroding British law and British sovereignty, again Britain should have walked away. However, my grouse over all these years was not so much about trade, but more about the danger that the European Union posed to the sovereignty of our shared crown. Whilst we are independent, and whilst in Australia the Queen is subject to the Australian Constitution and is named by an Australian Act of Parliament Queen of Australia, our Constitution is formed under the Crown of the United Kingdom, and any danger to that Crown is a danger to our own crown. We have seen in 1992 the Queen declared a citizen of Europe under the Maastricht Treaty. It was even stated on the Buckingham Palace website, as a national of the United Kingdom, the Queen is a citizen of the European Union. But surely the Queen could never be a national or a citizen of any country. She is the Queen. Is not Her Majesty above citizenship? Does she not belong to all those countries proud to call her Queen? However, gladly, last June, the peoples of the United Kingdom had their chance and clearly rejected the lies, the subterfuge, the misinformation, and the Euro heresy, and voted to leave Europe. But it is a democratic vote which seems to be rejected by so many popularists. Mrs. May should also not forget that 3/4 of the House of Commons were anti-Brexit, as are most of the House of Lords. This is one of the reasons why it was always likely, whatever was said, that an early election would be called. Mrs. May requires a mandate to bolster her status in discussions with EU authorities, but perhaps more importantly, to allow enough time for the disruption that unentangling decades of bureaucratic regulations and economic control will cause before going to the polls again. However, the problem of some 70% of business leaders wanting Britain to remain will still persist. It's a case of politicians and big business combined against the people. The Prime Minister and the government must therefore be ever watchful of potential trickery, even from those who may appear to be on her own side. The ranting and ravings of people like the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, and then Chancellor George Osborne, would obviously, at the referendum, have an effect on the unenlightened. We hope that they have now seen the light. But I do think that the seemingly invading hordes of Muslims into Europe and their traipsing through so many countries to get to sanctuary in Germany, courtesy of Frau Merkel, led many doubters to vote to leave and thus secure Britain's borders from European control. And I do hope that the government acts decisively in that regard. I did wonder about the decision of Theresa May when she became Prime Minister, but she does seem to have embraced the will of the people, and within 9 months of becoming leader, she has charted the passage of the European Union Withdrawal Bill through to royal assent and has now formally triggered Article 50 and begun the process through which the United Kingdom will sever one by one the tentacles of European control over virtually every facet of governance within this kingdom. But it's not going to be an easy task. There is a multitude of laws that must be repealed and masses of regulations that must be torn up before Britain can start to stand on its own feet. from the manner in which your seas and your fisheries have been surrendered to getting back that once-old favourite, the British sausage, let alone being able to display vegetables in imperial weights for those still unable to come to terms with metric measurements. There are many hurdles to overcome, particularly in dealing with the obstropolous and exacting officialdom in Brussels and Berlin and within Britain's bureaucracy itself. It'll be worse than rabid dogs scavenging over the pickings of an abandoned corpse. It's also quite likely that European officialdom may try to impose unwarranted tariffs on Britain in retaliation, even though, given Britain's trade deficit with the EU, Europe has more to lose than to gain, but they probably won't care about that. However, it is to be hoped that the people will understand and will not hold the government to task at this coming election or the one thereafter for the disruption that unentangling decades of bureaucratic regulation and economic control will cause. Eventually, those problems will subside, and Britain will hopefully be able to get on with its own life as an independent and as a free nation once again. Discussions are already being held with our Australian government, and our Trade Minister has already been over here for talks, as have ministers from other Commonwealth nations. However, be warned, it will not be as before. Commonwealth countries like Australia now have their own trading arrangements with a network of countries around the world. For better or for worse, and most think for worse, China is now Australia's major business partner. However, the former British dominions of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all share the same language, the same base laws, and the same base culture, all ingredients for a friendly association. Commonwealth countries such as India, the second most populous nation in the world, and the former British colony of the United States of America also share commonalities which make trading relationships much easier, although India will probably not give up its protectionist trade policies. Regrettably, most Commonwealth countries are today third world nations and are heavily reliant upon aid, which would obviously affect the viability of any trading arrangements with them. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting to be held in London in March-April next year will be a wow session to court trade with Commonwealth countries using Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle as stage props, all geared to impress us former colonialists. I do hope, however, that the British government is not using the potential of trade with the Commonwealth as a bargaining chip to pressure Europe into a favourable trading arrangement with the EU, which could preclude entering into outside treaties. It will then be Perfidious Albion indeed, a title, as I mentioned, it earned when it abandoned us over 40 years ago. But there is one matter that must be resolved if we are to renew our friendship, and that is entry into the United Kingdom. In the First World War, nearly 40% of young Australians volunteered to fight in Europe for Britain, and around 4.5% of our total population was either killed or wounded. It's often forgotten that immediately war was declared in 1939, before mobilization took place in Australia, Australians again straight away volunteered to fight for Britain in Europe, and as many Australians lost their lives fighting the Germans and the Italians as they did fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. With this sacrifice and with this bloodshed, just imagine the confusion, the anger, the bitterness of those Australians who had fought for Britain, or the families of those Australians, when they, returning to the motherland they had served, found themselves directed to the aliens or the others or the foreigners' gate, whilst the enemy they fought against walked blithely through the special EU entrance. For some 17 years, I have been advocating a special entry for subjects of the Queen, which all citizens of the Queen's realms are. But time and time and time and time again, the government and its Europhile bureaucracy have refused. The time has now come for Britain to show its sincerity by welcoming us into the United Kingdom as equals and not as some pesky colonials that they couldn't wait to get rid of and now treat as foreigners. It's now time for Britain to establish a special entry gate for countries like Australia who share the crown within our individual constitutions. I'm not talking about the technicality of visa requirements or open borders. I am sure we would not be very keen in taking all of those people you have absorbed into the kingdom, some of whom you've even put into the Lords, who seem to hate the British and everything Britain stands for. What, I wonder, of their allegiance given to the Queen? No, I'm talking about if Britain is serious about re-establishing ties with us, then they must stop treating us, who are also Her Majesty's subjects, with such callous indifference when we visit what was once our mother country. I therefore firmly believe that whilst the majority of today's Australians will welcome closer ties with the United Kingdom, we first need that special entry gate to show respect to us and not continue to treat us as foreigners. Thank you.
Well,